Okay, guys, today we're looking at indicator 1.6. We're going to be talking about political institutions. A couple of things that you need to be able to explain once we're done with this presentation. What was the differences between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists? You need to understand how they were going to solve the problem of war debt. You need to also understand how they were going to feel about tariffs. And you need to make sure that you understand what some of the compromises were and so on. So make sure you can answer those questions. And let's get started with 1.6. First, again, the two political parties are going to develop out of George Washington's cabinet. Those two political parties were going to be the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Sometimes the Anti-Federalists are sometimes referred to as the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists are mainly going to be led by Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of Treasury under George Washington. The Federalists believed in a loose interpretation of the Constitution, that they could sort of make the Constitution fit the things that they needed them to fit. The Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, are also known as the Democratic Republicans, are going to be led by Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson was the Secretary of State under George Washington, and the Anti-Federalists believed in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. You also remember that the Anti-Federalists are going to play a major role in getting the Constitution ratified, because in order for them to agree to ratify that Constitution, they wanted a Bill of Rights added, and so the Bill of Rights were added to the Constitution in order to get it ratified. Remember, the Federalists favored a strong central government, whereas the Anti-Federalists were more about states' rights and state power. One of the main arguments that they agreed on, though, was how to pay off war debt. So let's look at a couple of things as far as the differences between these groups and some of the arguments that they had early on. Of course, the first thing is going to be war debt, and the Federalists had a plan, and the Democratic Republicans or Anti-Federalists had a plan as well. The Federalist plan was to pay off this debt by issuing bonds. Remember, a bond is something that you could buy from the government. In return, it grew with interest, and after a certain time, you could get that money back as well as the interest that it earned. The other thing that the Federalists wanted to do was they wanted the national government to assume all the debts of the states from the war. So they were going to take up that war debt. And then the final thing was to promote trade with foreign countries. And they were hoping that by doing this, that this would help increase the economy and eventually help pay off some of that debt. The Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, believed that these bonds were bad, and they believed that paying off the debt for the national government was bad too, because they felt like a lot of the southern states had already paid their debt and did not want to have to take on the debt of the northern states who hadn't finished paying their debt. But eventually they came up with a compromise, and the compromise was that the Democratic Republicans would sort of go along with some of the things the Federalists wanted if they agreed to move the capital further south, and that's why we end up with the capital being in Washington, D.C. And if they did that, then the southern states would agree to help pay some of the debt. The other problem that they had was the argument over the national bank. The Federalists, of course, favored the national bank. They said that the federal government had the power to have a national bank because they could use the necessary and proper clause, also known as the elastic clause, meaning that they could make the national bank sort of fit into the Constitution. Democratic Republicans, on the other hand, said no, that the Constitution doesn't establish this, and it doesn't mention any control of a national bank. The conclusion was that the Federalists are going to win out. They are going to get that national bank, and they're going to use the elastic clause or the necessary and proper clause in order to make sure that that bank is put into place. Another argument that they had was about tariffs. The Federalists thought that tariffs would be good. Remember, a tariff is a high tax on an imported good. It's mainly designed to force consumers to buy local goods and not buy goods that are being imported or brought in from somewhere else. So they're trying to increase the sale of goods at home rather than buying things from overseas. So the Federalists, of course, favored this idea. They thought it would encourage American production. And they also wanted to issue a tax on whiskey. Of course, a lot of people drank whiskey back during that time, and they said they wanted to put the sales tax on whiskey, and hopefully that would bring more money into the government. Now, this is going to create some problems, and we're going to look at that in just a second. The Democratic Republicans, though, on the other hand, said no to the high tariffs. They said that the government was interfering. They were using too much government regulation to control the people. And of course, they were against this. The tax on whiskey, though, would be an issue because this is going to incite something known as the Whiskey Rebellion. The Whiskey Rebellion is going to show two things about the national government that it didn't have under the Articles of Confederation, but it does have now with the Constitution. And those two things are that the government has the power to tax, and that the government can raise an army in order to stop a domestic threat. So when this rebellion happens in Pennsylvania, when these farmers sort of rise up against the government because of this tax on whiskey, Washington is going to lead his troops in and stop the rebellion. And again, it shows the power of the federal government over domestic problems at that point. Remember that the United States would also have some issues with France during this period. Of course, France was our friend and our ally during the American Revolution, but when the French Revolution comes around in 1789, the United States is going to change their opinions a little bit about the French. Now, some people supported the French Revolution, one of those being Thomas Jefferson, because he thought that it was showing the ideas that were used for our revolution. But some people viewed the French Revolution as being too bloody, too violent, and therefore were totally against what the French were doing. Jefferson, of course, supported the French Revolution, and he, of course, was the former ambassador to France, so naturally he's going to go along with them. But Hamilton supported Great Britain, who was France's enemy at this point. After the revolution starts, it's going to be France versus Great Britain and some of its allies. And the British are trying to put an end to the new French government. But Hamilton would support Great Britain. And mainly the reason for supporting Great Britain was mainly an economic issue, more so than anything, because Britain was one of our major trading partners. Again, a couple of disagreements are going to happen. There's going to be a few of them. The XYZ affair, which we've talked about. Remember, the XYZ affair was where three ambassadors from France are going to demand a bribe from our ambassadors from the United States. And so we refer to those three French ambassadors as being XYZ because they just didn't want to mention their names because they thought this was so bad. And of course, the United States refused to pay that bribe. The other one was the Citizen Genet incident, where this guy, Citizen Genet, who was an ambassador, was sent to America and tried to enlist the help of American ships to attack British ships during the war with Great Britain. And then the final one was Jay's Treaty, where Jay had signed a treaty with Great Britain, sort of helping them out and them helping us out as well. And this is going to cause problems with the French again. So got some issues with France. So eventually those issues are going to get resolved. But at this point, it doesn't look good. The XYZ affair and the Citizen Genet, especially the Citizen Genet incident, would lead to the Alien and Sedition Acts. So what were the Alien and Sedition Acts? These were acts or laws that were passed under John Adams, who was a Federalist. And it was mainly out of suspicion that these foreign immigrants that were coming to the U.S. were here or trying to come here to try to overthrow our government, like Citizen Genet. The Federalists, though, originally put these acts into place as a political move to try to hurt the Democratic Republicans and to try to limit immigration into the United States. But all of this is going to eventually lead to John Adams being defeated in 1800 and Thomas Jefferson becoming the third president. Again, some things about the Alien and Sedition Acts allowed the president to deport any alien considered dangerous to the country. Also said that immigrants had to wait at least 14 years before they could become a U.S. citizen. The Virginia and Kentucky resolutions were all about trying to stop this Alien and Sedition Act. They were written by Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and they were a criticism of the Alien and Sedition Acts. And what it did was it gave the state legislatures a way to nullify any act of Congress that they thought was deemed as being unconstitutional. And this is a huge deal because for the first time, a state could override the U.S. government. And this was the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Let's look at 1.7. This deals mainly with the Supreme Court and the judicial policies. The Supreme Court was set up after the Constitution had been ratified, but they had a problem because they needed more courts other than just the Supreme Court. So the Judiciary Act of 1789 created a federal court system. The Constitution hadn't set a guideline as to how these federal courts should be set up, so this Judiciary Act of 1789 is going to help establish that. The guy that's going to be put in charge of the Supreme Court, the first Supreme Court, is going to be John Marshall. He's going to be the first Chief Justice. He supported a strong federal government because he was a Federalist. He was a Secretary of State under John Adams. And so he is going to go along with the Federalist ideas. He's going to serve for almost 30 years. And again, he was appointed by John Adams. Probably one of his most crowning achievements is going to be the policy of judicial review, which we're going to look at next. The main case that's going to occur when John Marshall is the Chief Justice is Marbury versus Madison. This happens when John Adams decides to flood the federal court system with these judges right before Thomas Jefferson would take office. And of course, the main purpose of these judges was to try to keep the Federalists in power, even though they had a Democratic Republican president. James Madison, who was the Secretary of State under Thomas Jefferson, once Thomas Jefferson becomes president, refuses to give one of those midnight judges, William Marbury, his appointment. This is going to cause John Marshall to step in with the Supreme Court, and he is going to rule that the Supreme Court didn't have the power to override the law to stop it. He's trying to make a point, too, though, that the Supreme Court needed more power, and this is what would establish the power of judicial review that the Supreme Court has even to this day. Judicial review says that the Supreme Court can determine the constitutionality of a law, so whether a law is constitutional or unconstitutional. Other key John Marshall cases that the Supreme Court dealt with include Gibbons versus Ogden. This said that the federal government could control interstate commerce, mainly dealing with trade between states. You also had Dartmouth versus Woodward. This said that contracts had to be upheld against the state government, even if the state government tries to do away with them. If there's a contract in place, they cannot do that. The third one was McCullough versus Maryland. This was all about the National Bank, and Maryland tried to stop the operations of the National Bank. The Supreme Court stepped in and said no, that you couldn't do that. And then the final one is Worcester versus Georgia, which we're going to talk about later on. But Worcester versus Georgia said that in order for Georgia citizens to go onto Cherokee land, they must have permission by the Cherokee themselves in order to go onto that land. Okay, that's going to do it for 1.6 and for 1.7.
Good afternoon. Please listen to the following announcements.
That's it. I'll
Picture
talk with
day
you
for
guys
makeups
later.
will be October 28th. Any student interested in taking the ASVAB, please sign up in the guidance office. The test will be given November 21st. Any